I won $46.7 million in the lottery, but when I tell you that was not the moment that changed my life, you might not believe me because what truly broke and rebuilt me was a single folded envelope sliding across a chipped wooden diner table, the weight of my Aunt Linda's trembling hands and her words echoing in my ears. I know this is almost all I have saved, but family helps family, and you must take it. And in that instant, the irony cut through me sharper than any betrayal, because only she, the one living on a retired teacher's pension and rationing her insulin, had given me her last $3,000. While the rest of my family, the ones with luxury kitchens, new Teslas, and vacation cruises booked months ahead, turned their backs on me without a blink. And if you are listening to me right now, tell me where you are watching from, because I need to know. Have you ever had to test the people closest to you? Have you ever stared into their eyes while begging for help and realized they only saw your weakness as a nuisance? I remember holding that winning ticket in my hands, the digits glowing under the kitchen light like a cruel secret, and I told myself I would keep silent. I would hide my fortune and discover the truth of blood ties, and what I uncovered was darker and colder than I ever imagined. My father's lecture about responsibility, my sister, Lisa's smug excuse about tuition and her Tesla, my brother Michael's text that vanished into silence, my stepmother's sharp voice slicing me down to size, and through it all, one voice rose above, weak but steady. Linda's a woman with nothing left to spare, giving me everything she had, and I swear to you that night in the diner with the smell of burnt coffee and the squeak of worn leather seats around us, I understood the truth, that money does not change people. It only reveals them, and that revelation became the start of a journey that would end with shattered illusions, public confrontations, and consequences none of them could escape. So stay with me, because what happened next is something you will not forget. My name is Natalie Harper. I am 32 years old, an accountant living in Denver, and if you ask me what my childhood looked like, I would tell you it was a long hallway lined with closed doors and the faint sound of my sister Lisa's laughter always on the other side. Because Lisa was the golden child, the one my parents proudly displayed in Christmas cards and Facebook posts, while I became the shadow trailing behind, too quiet, too ordinary, too unwilling to twist myself into the shape they wanted. And I still remember the way my father would introduce us at church, potlucks. This is Lisa. She is going to law school. She is our pride, and this is Natalie. Well, she is figuring things out, and how those words carved themselves into my ribs. And when my brother Michael came along years later, he was the baby, the charming one, the boy who could do no wrong. Even when he dropped out of community college and borrowed money, he never paid back. And my mother Evelyn would smooth his hair and say, "He is just finding his way," while I sat at the kitchen table doing everyone's taxes for free. Never once thanked, only told you should be grateful you are useful. So when I say I grew up in a house where love was conditional, I mean it was handed out like prize ribbons, shiny for Lisa, soft for Michael, and nothing but scraps for me. And the only person who ever looked me in the eye and saw me as more than a placeholder was my Aunt Linda, my mother's older sister, a retired English teacher with a gentle voice and wrists so thin you worried they might snap. She would call me her little scholar and slip me used paperbacks she bought from thrift shops, saying, "Read. Natalie words will save you when people fail you." And she was right, because when prom came and no one noticed, I had no dress. It was Linda who sewed one out of fabric she saved from curtains, sitting up all night with her old Singer machine while the rest of the family laughed about Lisa's designer gown. And when I graduated college quietly without a banner or party, Linda mailed me a handwritten card with $50 tucked inside, even though she lived on a pension that barely stretched to cover rent and insulin. And I think about that contrast often, the silence of my parents versus the small, steady kindness of the one person with the least to give. And maybe that is why years later, when life forced me into a test of loyalty, I instinctively knew Linda's answer would be different. But before that day in the diner, before the envelope slid across the chipped wood, there were countless smaller betrayals that primed me to doubt the very people who shared my blood. Like the time I missed a rent payment in my 20s after being laid off and called Lisa, who told me, Nat, you need to learn responsibility, and then posted pictures of her wine tasting weekend in Napa. Or the time Michael crashed my car and promised to pay for repairs, but instead showed up with a new tattoo and a sheepish grin, and my mother scolded me for expecting too much of him. He is your brother. You should love him without conditions. And I remember thinking, why is it only me who is asked to love without conditions? So I built my own small life in Denver, filing other people's taxes, living in a one-bedroom apartment with squeaky pipes, convincing myself that independence was enough, that not needing them meant I had already won. But the truth is, every holiday, every Thanksgiving dinner, every birthday, I felt the hollow echo of their dismissals, the way my father's toasts always excluded me, the way Lisa's children barely knew my name, the way Michael forgot to invite me to his engagement party, and I carried that ache quietly, burying it under spreadsheets and long commutes, until the night I bought a ticket on a whim at a gas station more out of boredom than hope, and watched as the numbers matched one by one, my breath catching in my throat, my hands trembling over the counter, and when I realized I had won not hundreds, not thousands, but $46.7 million, I did not scream or dance. I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the ticket as if it were a loaded gun, because I knew instantly that this paper would not save me. It would expose everyone, and the first faces that flashed before me were not strangers but my family. And in that moment, I promised myself I would not tell them. I would not give them the satisfaction of flocking around me like crows circling fresh meat. Instead, I would hold the secret close and discover the truth. And if you are still with me now, you know why that promise mattered. Because in the weeks that followed, the mask each of them wore began to crack, and the real test began. The night I held that ticket in my hand, the glow of the kitchen light flickering against the faded tiles, I realized my life had split cleanly in two before the numbers and after them, and yet instead of joy, there was a suffocating silence that wrapped itself around me, because I knew instinctively that this win would not be freedom. It would be a magnifying glass held over every fracture in my family. And so, I did what perhaps no one in my situation would have done. I locked the ticket inside a small metal cash box under my bed, the same box where I kept old rent receipts and expired coupons, and I whispered to myself, "Natalie, tell no one, because if you do, the vultures will circle." And in the days that followed, I moved like a ghost through the city going to work at the accounting firm, smiling politely at clients eating microwaved meals in my apartment, all the while knowing that I had $46.7 million waiting to be claimed. And yet I delayed, not because I doubted the numbers, but because I needed to think. I needed to map out the consequences, and I kept picturing Lisa's smirk, Michael's outstretched hand, Evelyn's sharp tongue, Gregory's calculating eyes, and my stomach would twist, so I tested the waters in small ways, dropping hints at family dinners, mentioning that work had been stressful or that bills were piling up, and every time the response was the same. Lisa rolling her eyes and saying, "You should manage better." Michael changing the subject to his latest side hustle. My mother reminding me not to be dramatic, and only Linda's quiet voice lingering after calls asking if I was sleeping, if I was eating well, if I had someone to talk to. And that was when the idea took root. If money reveals character, then perhaps I should create a stage and let them reveal themselves. So I sat at my desk one night, the ticket hidden inside the box, and I began drafting a plan. I would tell each of them separately that I had lost my job and needed a small loan to stay afloat. Nothing enormous, just $5,000 an amount that would sting, but not ruin them. And I would watch, I would listen, I would write down their answers, and I would know once and for all who saw me as family and who saw me as disposable. And the thought of it made my pulse race because it was cruel and it was cunning, but it was also the only way I could strip away their masks. So the next morning I ironed my work blouse, packed my lunch, and carried my secret like a stone in my chest. And when I sat across from my boss later that week, pretending to be worried about job security while nodding at tax forms, I nearly laughed at the absurdity, because behind my calm eyes I was rehearsing lines, the words I would deliver to each sibling, each parent, each in-law, as though I were performing in a play, and yet there was nothing fictional about it. It was the truest script I had ever written, and when the first call went out to Lisa and she answered with the sound of clinking wine glasses in the background, I felt the curtain rise on Act 1, and the story that would unravel everything had begun. The first test began with Lisa, because in my mind she was always the sharpest blade. Polished, smiling deadly, so I called her on a Tuesday evening when I knew she would be home from court, but not yet out to dinner, and she answered on speakerphone with the sound of ice clinking against glass. Her voice syrupy with wine as she said, "Nat, I hope this is quick. I'm prepping for tomorrow's deposition," and I swallowed hard and said, "Lisa, I lost my job. The firm is cutting staff, and I am 2 months behind on rent. I was wondering if you could lend me $5,000 just to get through." And there was a silence followed by a soft laugh, not cruel at first, but dismissive, and she said, "Nat, you're 32 years old. It's time you learned to stand on your own. I can't just hand out money every time you trip. Besides, James and I are saving for a new summer home in Cape Cod. Maybe you should pick up extra bookkeeping work, or, I don't know, be smarter with your choices." And the way she said smarter burned into me like acid, because I knew she wasn't hearing desperation. She was savoring superiority, and I thanked her quickly, hung up and wrote down her answer in my notebook, underlined it twice, then called Michael the next night, choosing him second because he always claimed to be the fun sibling, the one who would show up with pizza and jokes, and when he picked up his tone was warm. "Hey, Nat, what's up?" But as soon as I laid out the same story, lost job behind on rent, need $5,000 to bridge the gap, his warmth evaporated, replaced by nervous chuckling, and he said, "Man, I wish I could, I'm strapped right now between the car payments and the wedding deposits. And besides, Nat, you've always been the responsible one. You'll figure it out, right? I mean, $5,000 is nothing for you. You always find a way." And he pivoted instantly to telling me about the new tattoo he was getting on his forearm, laughing as though the topic of my crisis had already evaporated, and I wrote down his answer too, drawing a line under his name. Disappointment curdling in my stomach. Then came my parents, and I saved them for Sunday, because Sunday was when my mother Evelyn always called a ritual she maintained for appearances more than affection. So when I delivered the line, "Mom, I lost my job. I'm 2 months behind. I need $5,000. Her reaction was swift and cutting. "Natalie, don't be dramatic. You have always exaggerated your problems. Maybe if you stopped isolating yourself and married like your sister, you wouldn't be in these messes and in the background." I heard my father Richard clear his throat, then say faintly, "We're not a bank, Nat. We can't keep bailing you out." And I wanted to laugh because they had never bailed me out once in my life. Not when I needed textbooks, not when my car broke down, not when I sat in the ER alone with a sprained wrist. But I bit back the laugh and wrote down their words carefully because they revealed everything. Their indifference was as practiced as a script, and I told them, "Thank you anyway," hung up and sat in silence for a long time, the notebook in front of me like a ledger of betrayal. 3 calls, 3 rejections, and each carried its own flavor. Lisa's superiority, Michael's selfish avoidance, Evelyn and Richard's cruelty, and yet the plan was not complete because there were still others to test. So I drove across town one rainy evening to see my cousin Gregory and his wife Diane, knowing they were flush with money from Gregory's real estate firm, and I sat in their sleek living room, Diane arranging throw pillows as though she were staging a photo shoot, and I told them the same story. The words now memorized: job loss, rent overdue, need $5,000, and... Gregory leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and said, "Nat, $5,000 is pocket change. But giving money sets a dangerous precedent. You see, it teaches weakness, and we wouldn't want to enable you, would we?" And Diane chimed in, "Maybe you could sell some furniture or downsize. There's no shame in that." And I thought about their vacation photos plastered on social media. Bali sunsets, Paris dinners, and I forced a nod. Thanked them, walked out into the rain with my coat soaked through, and by then the pattern was clear. The wealthiest in my family treated my plea as either annoyance or opportunity for condescension, and I nearly ended the experiment there. But there was one more, the one person I both dreaded and longed to test my Aunt Linda, because though I believed in her kindness, some part of me feared that asking would taint it, would reveal that even she had limits. So I hesitated for days before driving to her modest apartment, the hallway lined with peeling wallpaper, the air thick with the smell of old books, and she greeted me in her cardigan, her hands trembling slightly as she held the door, and when I delivered the line, "Aunt Linda, I lost my job. I'm behind on rent. I need 5,000. Her eyes widened, not in judgment, but in worry, and she reached for my hand instantly, saying, "Oh, sweetheart, I don't have 5,000. I barely have 3, but if 3,000 helps, it's yours. I can cash out my small savings account tomorrow. You can pay me back whenever." And her voice broke as she said it because she knew it was everything she had, and in that moment, I felt my throat tighten because the experiment was over. The data was collected and the truth was undeniable. The richest in my family had given me nothing but lectures, while the poorest had offered her last breath of security without hesitation, and I left her apartment with tears stinging my eyes, the envelope heavy in my pocket, not because of the money inside, but because of what it represented, the final, irrefutable proof of who loved me and who only loved what I could provide, and I drove home through the rain that night knowing the stage was set for the confrontation to come. I sat in my apartment that night with the envelope from Aunt Linda on the table in front of me, the rain tapping against the window like a relentless metronome. And for a long time, I couldn't bring myself to open it because I knew that whatever was inside carried more weight than its dollar amount. It was not 3,000 pieces of green paper. It was her trust, her sacrifice, her willingness to bleed for me when no one else would spare a drop. And finally, I slid it open and saw the neat stack of 20s and 50s, each one folded carefully as if she had been preparing this for years, and a small note written in her familiar looping script. It simply said, "You are never alone." Love, Aunt Linda, and the words blurred before my eyes because they cut through every scar I carried from my parents' dismissal, my sister's arrogance, my brother's selfishness, and I realized with painful clarity that Linda had been the only constant in my life, the only one who showed up without conditions. And the guilt came hard and fast because my test had forced her into a sacrifice she could not afford. And I hated myself for putting her in that position, even as I knew it had given me the truth I needed. So I made a decision. I pulled the lottery ticket from the metal box under my bed, held it next to her envelope, and whispered into the empty room, "This is not mine alone. This is ours," because she had proven what blood should mean. She had proven family through action, not words. And the next morning I drove back to her apartment, the hall still smelling of musty books, and I found her at the kitchen table with a half-finished crossword, her glasses perched low, and I set the ticket on the table in front of her watching as confusion crossed her face. Then shock, then disbelief when I explained Aunt Linda, "I didn't lose my job. I didn't need money. I won the lottery, 46.7 million, and her hand flew to her mouth as if she could physically hold back the gasp. And for a moment she just stared at me eyes wide before whispering, "Natalie, is this real?" And when I nodded, tears spilled down her cheeks, not for herself, but for me. And she kept shaking her head saying, "Why didn't you tell your parents? Why didn't you tell Lisa?" And I laughed softly, bitterly, because I already had my answers written in that notebook, and I slid it across the table for her to read the pages filled with dates, names, and their exact words. And as she read, she grew quiet, her lips pressed tight, and finally she said, "You were right to test them, sweetheart, because now you know, and knowing is power. But promise me one thing. Promise me you won't let their failures harden you, because money can build walls or it can build bridges, and the choice is yours." And I reached across the table, took her frail hand in mine, and said, "I promise, but I will never again let them treat me as less." And in that moment, the air between us felt like a covenant, sealed not by blood, but by truth. And the guilt that had weighed on me began to shift into resolve, because I knew what had to come next. There would be a confrontation. Not just whispers in notebooks or private tears in apartments, but a moment where each of them would face the mirror. I held up, and though the thought of it made my chest tighten, I also felt a strange calm because the one person whose opinion mattered most had already seen me, believed me, and given without expectation. And that meant I was no longer a child begging for scraps of approval. I was a woman holding the power to redefine the story, and soon they would learn that too. The confrontation came 2 weeks later on Thanksgiving, a holiday that had always been a theater of favoritism in my family, with Lisa carving the turkey like royalty. Michael cracking jokes too loud, my mother Evelyn orchestrating the seating chart to spotlight her chosen children and me, tucked at the far end of the table, as though my presence were an afterthought. But that year I arrived early with Aunt Linda at my side. Her arm looped through mine, and when Evelyn opened the door, her eyes flicked over Linda with thinly veiled disdain before narrowing at me, muttering, "You're late as usual," even though we were 30 minutes early, and I smiled calmly because I knew what was coming. We sat through the first hour of stiff conversation, Lisa bragging about a promotion, Gregory boasting about property sales, Michael showing off his new watch, and I listened in silence. My notebook tucked in my bag, my chest tight with the weight of the secret I was about to unload. Then when my father Richard stood to make his traditional toast glass raised, thanking everyone for making him proud, his eyes lingering on Lisa and Michael and sliding past me as though I were invisible, I rose too, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and for a moment the room went still, forks frozen in midair, and I said, "Before we toast, I have something to share," and I reached into my bag, pulled out the notebook, placed it on the table beside the turkey platter, and said, "2 months ago I told each of you that I lost my job and needed $5,000, and I watched as confusion flickered across their faces. Lisa smirking, Michael frowning, Evelyn pursing her lips, and I continued. I asked because I wanted to see who would show up for me, and I wrote down every word you said, and my voice did not tremble. I read Lisa's line first. You told me to be smarter to manage better while planning a summer home in Cape Cod, and her smirk faltered. Then I read Michael's excuse about tattoos and wedding deposits, and his jaw tightened. Then I read Evelyn and Richard's dismissals calling me dramatic, reminding me you were not a bank, and my father coughed, shifting uncomfortably, and I finished with Gregory's lecture about enabling weakness. Diane's suggestion, I sell furniture, and then I held up Linda's envelope still with her neat note tucked inside, and I said, but when I asked Linda, she didn't hesitate. She didn't shame me. She gave me her last $3,000, everything she had, because she loves without conditions. And in that moment, the silence was so heavy, it felt like the air had turned to glass. And then Lisa scoffed, rolling her eyes, saying, "What is this? Some kind of performance? Are we supposed to clap for Linda's bad financial planning?" And something in me snapped, not with rage, but with clarity. And I said, "No, you're supposed to see yourselves because while you hoard your comfort and sneer at me, the one person with the least to give showed me what family really means." And then I reached again into my bag, pulled out the folded lottery ticket, placed it beside Linda's note, and the gasp that rippled around the table was like a wave crashing. Michael choking on his drink, Evelyn's eyes widening, Richard's glass clattering onto the table, and I said, I didn't lose my job. I won $46.7 million, and I didn't tell you because I wanted to know the truth. And now I do. I know who you are when you think I'm powerless. I know who you are when there's nothing to gain, and you failed all of you except her. And I pointed to Linda, who sat trembling, tears in her eyes, and Lisa lunged forward, her voice sharp. "Natalie, you can't hold that against us. You lied. You manipulated us. This is cruel," and I cut her off. My voice steady. "No, Lisa, this is honest. This is the first honest moment in this family." And Michael tried to laugh, forced and brittle, saying, "Come on, Nat, we're family. Of course we would have helped if we knew it was real." And I slammed my hand down on the table, the sound echoing, and I said, "That's the point. You would only help if there was something in it for you." But Linda helped because she loved me, period. And Evelyn finally spoke her tone, icy. "Natalie, this spectacle is disgraceful. Money makes people irrational. We're your parents. We deserve respect." And I turned to her, meeting her gaze squarely, and said, "Respect is earned, and you never earned mine." And for the first time in my life, I watched her face go pale, as though she had never considered that her power over me could fracture. And I leaned back, the room buzzing with tension, and said, "So, here's the truth. None of you will see a dime, not a cent, not a loan, not a gift, because you already showed me what I'm worth to you." And Lisa sputtered, Michael cursed, Gregory muttered about fairness, and Evelyn whispered, "You'll regret this," but I didn't flinch. I closed the notebook, slid it back into my bag, took Linda's hand, and said quietly, "Dinner is over," and together we walked out of that house. The stunned silence of my family behind me, their world crumbling. Not because I won millions, but because they realized in that instant they had lost me, and that loss was something money could never buy back. The days after Thanksgiving were a blur of messages and threats, Lisa leaving voicemails dripping with rage, accusing me of humiliating her in front of the children, Michael sending texts that swung from begging to cursing, my parents writing a long email about betrayal and disrespect. But instead of crumbling the way I once might have, I contacted my lawyer, Philip, a calm man with sharp eyes, and I explained everything: the lottery win the notebook, the family test, and he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and said, "Natalie, if you want to make sure this money is never used against you, we can structure it in a trust shielded untouchable with Aunt Linda as co-beneficiary." And the sound of those words felt like chains snapping off my wrists, so I signed the documents, placed her name beside mine, and when Philip asked about the others, "Lisa, Michael, my parents," I shook my head and said, "Not a cent, not a clause, not even a line in the will." And he nodded, saying, "Then we'll make it airtight," and we did every dollar locked where their hands could never reach, and to drive the point home, I made one more choice. I donated $2 million to establish a nonprofit in Linda's name, the Harper Wilson Foundation, dedicated to helping retired teachers like her who lived alone and struggled with medical bills. And when the local paper picked up the story running a photo of me and Linda holding the oversized check smiling awkwardly in front of a banner, the fallout was immediate. Neighbors called, reporters emailed, and my family saw it all splashed across social media. Lisa tagged by mutual acquaintances, Michael's friends forwarding the article, and the silence from them turned from fury to desperation. First, Evelyn called again, her voice tight, saying, "Natalie, you've made your point, but this is family. Money, blood money." And I cut her off with a quiet laugh, saying, "No, Mom, this is my money and Linda's," because she is the only blood who remembered what that word means. And Richard tried next, stammering about legacy and duty. But I told him legacy is built by actions, not entitlement. And the calls stopped for a while until a letter arrived, legal stationery with Gregory's firm logo, threatening to contest my decisions on grounds of undue influence by Linda. And I almost laughed out loud because I had every text, every voicemail, every line in that notebook evidence of their true characters. And Philip filed a preemptive injunction, warning Gregory that any attempt to litigate would result in those recordings and notes becoming public record. And within days, the threats evaporated, the silence settling heavy and cold. And through it all, Linda would call me in the evenings, her voice soft, asking if I was sure I wanted to burn bridges this way, and I would tell her yes, because bridges to places of cruelty are not worth crossing. And slowly the weight began to lift, because I had not just exposed them, I had closed the door legally, financially, irrevocably. And when I walked past the firm one last time, resignation letter in hand, knowing I never had to balance another stranger's taxes unless I chose to, I felt free, not because of the millions, but because the people who once defined my worth had no power, left their claws dulled against the shield I built, and the justice of it was not just in the law or the trust documents, but in watching them scramble, watching Lisa try to spin the story as my cruelty, Michael sulk on Facebook about ungrateful siblings, Evelyn whisper to church friends about my rebellion, and knowing that none of it mattered because the truth was already written, already proven, already sealed in the ink of Linda's trembling hand, offering me everything she had when no one else would. Life after the storm did not look like luxury cars or glittering parties. It looked like mornings in Linda's small kitchen where the sunlight spilled through lace curtains onto chipped mugs of coffee. It looked like planting marigolds together in the patch of soil outside her apartment building. It looked like laughter that came easily because it was not bought or bartered, and though the bank balance now carried more zeros than I could comprehend, I found myself craving simplicity, craving the peace of knowing that no one in the room was weighing my worth against their own greed. So Linda and I began to build a new rhythm. She moved into a modest 2-bedroom house I purchased in both our names, close enough to the library she loved, and I took joy in watching her unpack her shelves of worn paperbacks, arranging them with the care of a curator, each book a piece of her life. And I realized then that money used well was not about spectacle, but about security, about creating spaces where fear could not creep in, and so I expanded the foundation, hiring a small staff funding grants for teachers who had given decades to classrooms only to retire into poverty. And every time I signed a check, I thought of Linda's hands trembling as she offered me her last $3,000, and I swore silently that her sacrifice would echo in 1,000 classrooms, 1,000 quiet lives made easier, and for myself. I chose work that fed my mind rather than drained it. I left the accounting firm behind and began consulting on my own terms, picking projects that interested me. Setting hours that allowed for long walks in the park evenings, cooking simple dinners, weekends, traveling with Linda to places she had only read about standing with her in front of the Eiffel Tower, her eyes wide with childlike wonder, and I felt something heal in me each time she gasped at a new horizon, because for once I was not the forgotten daughter. I was not the invisible sibling. I was a woman shaping her own life with the only family member who had truly seen me. And though the others lingered at the edges of my thoughts, their absence was no longer a wound. It was a boundary, a clear line drawn in the sand, and I found that peace grows quickly in the soil of boundaries. It blooms without effort when you no longer water the weeds, and in quiet moments I would catch Linda watching me with a soft smile, as though she saw not just the niece she had once stitched a dress for, but the woman who had finally stepped into her own light, and it was in those looks, those moments of unspoken pride, that I understood the truest meaning of wealth, not the numbers in the account, but the weight that lifts when you finally know you are loved without conditions. When I look back now, months after that Thanksgiving confrontation after the papers were signed and the voices of my family faded into silence, I see the story not as one about money, but about mirrors, because what the lottery did was not change me or them. It simply held up a mirror and forced us all to see who we already were. Lisa, the proud, Michael, the careless, my parents, the cold, Gregory, the calculating, and Linda, the steadfast, and the knowledge of that truth has been both a wound and a gift. Because sometimes I still wake in the night, hearing my mother's voice telling me I was dramatic, hearing Lisa's laugh as she dismissed me, but then I remember the feel of Linda's hand sliding that envelope across the table, the weight of her last $3,000 given without hesitation. And I realize that gesture rewrote every cruel line of my past. It redefined family for me, and it showed me that love is proven not in grand declarations, but in quiet sacrifices, in actions taken when no one is watching, and that is the lesson I carry now into every part of my life, into the foundation that bears her name, into the way I choose friends, into the way I walk through the world. No longer begging for validation, but standing in the certainty that I am enough. And I want to say this to anyone listening who has felt invisible in their own family, who has been told you are less, who has been asked to love without ever being loved back. You are not alone. Your worth is not measured by their blindness. And sometimes the family you need is the one who surprises you, the one who shows up when no one else does. And if money ever enters your life in abundance or in scarcity, remember this: it will never create love. It will only reveal it, and the truest wealth you can hold is not in bank accounts, but in the hands that reach for you without conditions. And I know now with unshakable clarity that when Aunt Linda whispered, "You are never alone," she was giving me something no amount of millions could buy. She was giving me a truth that will outlast every dollar, and that is the inheritance I will carry until my last breath. So now that you've heard my story, I want to turn the question over to you, because maybe you have been in a similar position, maybe not with millions of dollars, but with the currency of trust. Maybe you have asked yourself who in your life would show up if you had nothing left to give, and maybe you have been surprised by the answer. I know I was. So tell me in the comments, have you ever tested the people closest to you, and what did you find out? Because sometimes those discoveries cut deep, but sometimes they set you free. And if you are watching this late at night with headphones in, or maybe over your morning coffee, let me ask you, what time is it where you are, and what city are you listening from? I love seeing how far these stories travel, from small towns to big cities, from the quiet countryside to bustling streets. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt that ache of being overlooked or dismissed, then know that you are part of a community here. We share these stories not just for drama, but for connection, because every like and every comment tells the algorithm that these voices matter, that these truths deserve to be heard. So, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because trust me, the twists we share here will keep you thinking long after the video ends. And if you want to go one step further, you can support the channel with a super thanks, or by sharing this story with a friend who might need to hear it, because you never know who is quietly sitting with the same scars, wondering if they are alone. And as I close this chapter, I'll leave you with the thought that has carried me through money didn't change my family. It revealed them, and maybe that truth, painful as it was, became my freedom. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for walking through this journey with me, and until next time, hold close the people who prove their love in action, not words, because that more than any lottery ticket is what makes us rich.